I was speaking with someone this week on some issue, and he kept saying, what does the Torah have to say about this? And I was thinking it's a very strange question. It's not a Torah question. He's not asking me a Talmudic source, what's the meaning of it, or a halachic question. He's asking me, a normal political, whatever question. And he kept saying, what does the Torah have to say about it? So I think I want to discuss here, when we live our life, is there certain areas of decisions we make, which we make irrespective or irrelevant of the Torah? Is there a place logic or our own intuition have, which is the decision-making factor, not the halacha? Are there any decisions we make in our life which shouldn't be made by looking at Torah sources and deciding, okay, the Torah says X, the Torah says Y? Rather, we look at these issues and we decide them because we have an intuition or our logic compels a certain decision. So we say, yeah, don't do this because the Torah says. What does the Torah say? No, Torah is not the place we go to for such a question. We decide because we know this is right. And the Mishnah is an opinion of someone who says a soneh, a man who hates his friend, they hate each other. If he ends up killing him, according to one person in the Mishnah, you can sentence him to death, even without hatra, even without forewarning. So the Talmud explains, normally if someone is put to trial, there has to be forewarning before he did the act, and only then can you put him on trial. If there was no forewarning, you can't punish him for murder. But if someone hates his friend, according to this rabbi, because he hates him, even without the forewarning, you could. So Talmud explains, let's say you've got a man, he's a Talmid Chacham, it's Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, he knows the whole Torah. If he were to, kill someone, heaven forbid, would you say that he doesn't need forewarning because he already knows it's forbidden? Is the only reason we do the forewarning to inform people so they should know you shouldn't do this? Yeah? So according to this rabbi, if the person already knows it's forbidden, you don't have to give forewarning. Therefore, if he kills someone, you don't need the forewarning, you can put him on trial. The same applies to a person who hates his friend, right? You could assume it was done with intent. So you don't need the forewarning, he must have known it's wrong and he did it anyways. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a lahavchin ben shogeg lemezid. Yeah, that's the principle. So Talmud explains that therefore, according to this rabbi in the Mishnah, if someone hates his friend, it wasn't an accident, he did it intentionally. And because we know he did it intentionally, there's no need for forewarning because he did it intentionally, he intentionally killed someone. So Rabbi Yosef Engel asks, but maybe he didn't know the Torah forbids it. Maybe he knew he's killing him and he intentionally killed him, but he didn't know you're not allowed to murder. He didn't read the Bible. He didn't read the 10 Commandments. He did not know the Torah says don't kill. Yeah? So Rabbi Yosef Engel gives the answer. There are certain things you don't need the Torah to tell you, like don't kill. The reason you don't kill is because you're human. You know you don't kill. That's the example you mentioned. The Torah says don't kill, but even with other Torah telling you not to kill, you know it's wrong to kill. Therefore, if you know it's wrong to kill, there's no need for forewarning to tell you the Torah says don't kill, because even with other Torah telling you not to kill, you know it's wrong to kill. This is the principle Rabbi Yosef Engel builds that, it's clear from the Talmud, according to this rabbi in the Mishnah, that when something is intuitively wrong, we know something is wrong, there is no need for the Torah to tell us, and it's almost like a tautology for the Torah to tell us in the sense that there's no need for warning because you already know it's wrong. So therefore, when the person can be sentenced to death, even without the forewarning. This is the premise where we see that certain ideas are logically compelling. Before we eat, for example, right? We eat in the bread or we eat, cake or something. We make a bracha before we eat. Why do we make a bracha before we eat? The Torah doesn't say the Torah says to bless after you eat. The Torah does not say you have to bless the food before you eat. Talmud says that it's logically compulsory. Why? When you go to someone's house, let's say, right? You can't just open the fridge and start eating. There you go. Some people would, some people wouldn't. In general, it's impolite to take other people's things without, warning them, without asking in advance. So when we eat, the whole world belongs to God. It's logical that we should first, it's a svara, it's logical that we should first, say, hey, can I eat this bread, make a blessing, and then you could eat it. So if it's logical, it becomes compulsory. So the Pnei Yehoshua, one of the major commentaries in the Talmud, so he says that it's a biblical commandment, Torah commandment, to make a blessing before you eat. And Maharil also, there are quite a few rabbis who have adapted this position, and they said to make a blessing before you eat is a Torah commandment. It's not rabbinic, it's Torah, because something that is logically compulsory becomes a Torah law. Now, halakha does not accept this position. We believe it's a rabbinic prohibition. Yeah, the Noda Bihuda in his book Tzion Nefesh Chaya, he has a long essay on that, and he explains that actually it's only a rabbinic prohibition, and he gets into that. But the Pnei Yehoshua, as well as other rabbis, have argued that the fact that it's logical becomes a Torah prohibition. Now, there actually is precedent for this idea that sometimes something which is logical becomes almost as important or more important than the Torah. Sometimes the Talmud is going to say that something is logical. So the Talmud brought us a verse to prove something. You don't need a verse. You don't need the Torah to tell me. It's logical. Yeah, you don't need a verse. Or a very good example for this is in the concept of murder. The Talmud discussing the three avirot which are better to die for than to violate the prohibition. One of them is the Nara Hamurasa, an engaged woman, a married woman, for her to have an affair or to be with her. The Talmud says that it's better to die than to be with this woman. How do I know this? I learned it from murder. A murderer, it's better to get killed than to commit the sin of murder. So too, it's better to get killed than to commit this violation. How do I know it's better to die than to commit murder? The Talmud says it's logical, right? And then Talmud brings a story in which we see that you can't choose whose blood is more red. Yeah, my chazit. How do you know that your blood is more red than his blood? Meaning your life is more important than his life. So it's logical, and because it's logical, the Torah knew you would understand this, and the Torah relied on your understanding that you should learn from this commandment to the other. So Torah itself taught you a law relying on something which is logical. Yeah, Torah said that the Torah juxtaposed the violation of the sexual prohibitions with murder to teach you something which is only derived from logic. So why is the Pnei Yehoshua wrong? Why don't we follow halachically the opinion of the Pnei Yehoshua that blessing food before we eat is a biblical prohibition? Why do we say it's only rabbinic? So I saw Rabbi Yosef Engel and Rabbi Reuven Margaliot. We've spoken about Rabbi Reuven Margaliot in the past. He was a major rabbi. He was a very big Zionist rabbi. Rabbi Yosef Engel was a Polish rabbi. They both say very similar things. Reuven Margaliot uses the term Ben Adam Lachaveiro. Rabbi Yosef Engel uses a bit more tricky language. He writes an external logic. But like a logic you don't need the Torah for. But the general principle they derive is as follows. A logic is compulsory when it comes to logics or intuition about how humans should interact with each other, like murder, stealing, these kind of things. When it comes to spiritual things or religious obligations, which are not how people interact with each other, but they're like a religious thing, in such cases, intuition plays about ethical things. Intuition plays an important role, and that's the deciding factor. When it comes to religious obligations, then God tells us what he wants, so we listen to God. So even although it's logical that we should eat before, make a blessing before we eat, it does not become a Torah prohibition. But any logical thing, when it comes to a ethical thing, when it comes to a logic which does not discuss the religion, it discusses external things like human affairs, over there it becomes binding on a Torah level, on a biblical level, without the Torah telling you, because it's simply a human intuition. Now, sometimes there is going to be a contradiction between what the Torah says and what the Torah and what our intuition says. Rabbi Amiel, who I think we've spoken about in the past, he spoke about the idea that the regesh hamusar, the ethical component of a person's feeling, and the religious one are like twins. You can't have the one without the other. What he means to say is as follows. He explains this. When somebody feels a certain thing as intuition, that's gonna affect how we think of the religion, because the religion cannot be unethical. So you can't be a properly religious Jew without taking your ethical feeling seriously, independent of Torah. But he says the same applies to an ethical person. You can't be a completely ethical person unless you're well rooted in Jewish religious values. He says that too, you can't have either of them independently. You can't be a person who lives a Torah life completely with Torah without taking into account, human emotion and our intuition and our logic. If you just blindly follow, like a fundamentalist, everything that it says without, questioning it with your own intuition, you're not fulfilling the religion properly, because God gave us this intuition for a reason. But he says the same applies to the other direction also. If somebody is ethical and doesn't take religious into account at all, does not think about the Torah and what it teaches us with ethics, that also has its flaw, and therefore that person also isn't completely an ethical person. That's the argument Rabbi Amiel made. Ethics, which is beyond Torah law, there's a long precedent of rabbis discussing this issue, explaining that when, for example, the Rambam, Maimonides in Moreh Nevuchim, he writes, when someone passes away, and they go up to heaven, they'll be judged. They'll be judged for the laws which they violated, which are written in the Torah, but also though for those laws which they violated, which are not written anywhere, but the person should have known that they're wrong. So God's going to punish them for doing those also. Or another great example is the Mabul, right? The people who committed sins by the Mabul, were they commanded in those sins? Or another example is when Cain and Abel, right? So he kills him, and then God tells him, "Where's your brother? Am I my brother's guardian? Was he wrong? Did God ever tell him not to kill?" So the Chizkuni explains that there are certain things which you don't need to be commanded. Right? It's obvious you don't kill. It's obvious you don't steal. There's no need in such a commandment. There's the Gerer dynasty. I believe it goes back to the Chidush Harim, this idea, where they say that if somebody, let's say, makes a commitment to someone and doesn't pull through on it, he promises something and then he changes his mind last minute. Let's say two people say, "Oh, let's enter partnership. We both put in $1 million. We'll build a house and then we'll rent out apartments." And they've been working on this for a month. Last minute, he changes his mind. Has he committed a sin? So he has technically not violated any sin, but the court makes him promise that the same way God punished the people in the Mabul, he will be punished. So they say in the name of the Chidush Harim, why like the Mabul? Why are we comparing him to the Mabul? So the explanation he gave was as follows. There are certain things which are technically not sins, right? But a person does not behave that way, right? If you enter a partnership without signing a deal, without making an actual commitment, just talk, technically speaking, you're legally allowed to change your mind, right? You've never signed a document, you've never done anything. So the person's invested in this business deal. Months later, you've changed your mind. You've technically not violated anything. But we all know it's wrong. Just because you can't point at the Shulchan Aruch and say, "This is the law you violated," just because there isn't a specific law against this, doesn't mean what you did was okay. And that's why we compare them to the Mabul, because just because someone wasn't commanded in something, they could still be punished for doing the wrong thing. So just like God punished them when they didn't violate any sin, so to this person who changed his mind from a business deal will be punished without violating any specific sin. The precedent for this idea, they can be punished for violating things which are wrong, goes back many centuries. The Talmud discussing different animals, what we could learn from them, says even if the Torah wasn't given, would have learned tzniut from a cat and from a chicken, and from animals we have learned different derech eretz, and we've learned different human ethical traits from animals. So why does the Torah command us not to steal? Why does the Torah command us not to kill if it's all logical, right? There obviously needs to be a certain balance between source and logic, as Rabbi Mendel explained, right? We can look at nature and we can see certain things, and we can see this is a good way of behaving, this is a bad way of behaving. But without the Torah telling us what's right and what's wrong, nothing will ever be an absolute. So we need both the Torah, and we need the nature to tell us, like to learn tzniut from animals, to learn derech eretz from animals. So we need both. We need the Torah to ground us in what's absolute, and we need to use our intuition as to what's right and what's wrong. And this is what Rabbi Mendel meant when he said that the ethics and the Torah are twins. You both need them independently, but you can't have one without having the other one completely. So you have to be well grounded in both, and they complement each other. Rabbi Mendel Kasher, I think we've also discussed here, he spent his whole life studying the Torah of the Rogachover, who was very into philosophy of halakha and these kind of things. So he wrote an article on what he called Svara de Oraita, a Svara which is compelling on a Torah level. And he gave a very interesting explanation. He discussed this Talmudic passage with the animals, that we can study ethics from them and from all the different sources where the Talmud uses a logic as opposed to a verse to learn something. And he said as follows. He said, we look at nature. We look at how animals behave. The Torah wants us to learn from how animals are created. He saw a certain divine ruling or teaching. He saw nature as divine. So when you look at nature and you see how God created the world, that itself should be a telling for you how to behave. When God created such a well-behaved cat, well-behaved chickens, a well-behaved universe, we should learn from this how we should be behaving, because it's all divine. It makes the argument you're making. The Talmud picks good traits of animals. Why don't we learn from animals that eat their own children to eat your own child, right? Right. So when we look at nature, we look at what seems right about nature and what sits well with us. It doesn't mean we could start learning from, spiders to eat your partner or, right? But anyways, it's a fair objection, yeah? It's a very fair objection. Also, I think you could argue, when you look at, again, I never thought this through properly, but I'm just going to make the case anyways. When we look at nature, again, this is just, I'm spitballing. I didn't see if there's any sources for this. But when we look at nature, there are certain things in nature which are unproductive. They don't help. Like, then you look at animals, and what you would think is unproductive, but actually is productive, like tzniut. Intuitively, tzniut should not be a productive thing, right? Intuitively, a species should be able to multiply quicker or be better if they weren't tzniut. Yet we see that that animals like the chatul, right, they have to go to the bathroom, and it does help them. So we're looking at beneficial values in animals. Eating your own child, for example, as some animals do, is not a beneficial trait. There are certain things which are objectively beneficial. Eating your child is objectively not beneficial. I think there are certain things you could see. Are they how do you define beneficial? You have to define it by not just for this individual, but for the species to survive or do better than other alternatives would have been, right? That would just have to be how you define the. So eating your own child is obviously not going to be beneficial because you'll have less of your species, right? If they analyzed animals, or wouldn't just animals, because humans also, but how many kids and how many children are born with one birthing, and how many kids they have, and how much people take care of their kids. So if let's say you think of humans or two-legged animals, right? It's very hard to birth many children if you've got two legs, if you walk, right? And two legs. So usually it's 1-2 kids that are born, not just by humans. So you end up having less animals or less humans or less creatures born from this family, making one animal die a lot more vulnerable, one human die from a family, a lot more vulnerable for that family or for the species. But if you look, let's say, at cats, they give birth to 20, 30 cats throughout their lifetime, even more. They don't need long lifespans because even in a short time, they can have many children. And if one child dies, it doesn't put the species, it doesn't make it vulnerable at all. You have 20 kids, 10 of them die. You've got more than humans do with none of them dying, right? So the children aren't reliant on parents as much. So the care we have towards our children, or the care that you'll have certain monkeys that they have towards their children, you'll simply not find it by cats or by dogs, which I think is fascinating. People who study ethics, why do we feel the way we do? Many people have a certain Darwinian understanding of ethics. Ethics or morals develop at what helps most the society. So if let's say we weren't kind to one another, we would end up losing the most. Have I spoken over here in the past about the chimpanzee? I think I have. Were you here? Yeah. Okay, great. So altruism would not be beneficial ultimately because we'd end up not getting help, right? But when two people mutually help each other, have that agreement, right? That would make us want to help others if they help us. So almost all the ethics we've developed, morals we've developed, are actually beneficial for us. Which is, again, a very counterintuitive thing, but some people who study morals and ethics believe that in a certain Darwinian understanding of morals and ethics that developed as a form of survival of the fittest. In any case, be that as it may, it's a bit off topic by now. Even if that is how morals developed, I still believe it to be divine. I still believe it to be that God I still see that as a divine system, that we've got morals in us to guide us, however it came to be. So I don't really think of these as problems in the argument I'm making. So Rabbi Mendel Hurwitz, he saw certain divinity to the world. He understood that when you look at nature and you see certain things are right, God made it that way so we can learn from it, so we can analyze it. Almost like an Einstein or a Spinoza kind of a world where you look at nature and you see the God within the nature, and you learn from it and you study from it, and connecting to nature itself will make you a better person. So Rabbi Mendel Hurwitz argued, if that's true to animals, which are God's creations, it's true to chickens, to cats, why is it not true to the human brain? Is that not a creation of God? If we can analyze cats, we can analyze dogs, we can analyze chickens, and we can see the divine nature in them, why don't we analyze our own thoughts? Why don't we analyze what we seem to think is right and wrong, right? Our logic, that is also divine, that was also created. So why don't we analyze our own logic and see in that, right? God created that too. Right? Why don't we see in that what our mind is telling us, what our logic tells us, what our logic dictates, and why don't we use that to determine what's right and what's wrong? I probably should finish on this note, but I think I'll mention one more interesting thing, which is when rabbis make rulings in halakha, which is, I think, is the most interesting thing. You've got a machloket between two rabbis. And traditionally speaking, let's say you've got in science, you want to know, any scientific question, and you've got a debate amongst two great academics, right? When you say, okay, let's follow the majority or the consensus, what you're really saying is, I think the consensus is the correct opinion. Right? I think they are correct and the other one is wrong. And if it turns out otherwise, I'll change my mind, right? The reason I'm following the consensus is because probably if more people say this, they're probably correct. They're probably right, right? So I believe the other side is incorrect. But there isn't an inherent logic in following the majority as opposed to the minority. There isn't any real reason, because if the minority are correct, I should be following the minority. Only one of them is right. Yeah, in any scientific issue, any historic issue, if you want to know the fact and there's a disagreement, one of them is right, one of them is wrong, and I follow the consensus simply because I'm hedging my bets with the majority. In halakha, we see a very interesting thing. We see that, say, Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai have an argument, right? We follow the majority as terms of psak. It could be Beit Shammai were right. And we don't even seem to be bothered with who's right. That's not for example, Rabbi Meir was smarter than his friends. We still don't follow the halakha like him. Who is correct? It doesn't seem to be an interesting thing. So you're going to ask me a question. You're going to tell me, look, God said something. He either meant this or he meant that. Why do we not care which one's the correct one? Why are we following the majority as opposed to the correct one? Right? So you have a lot of theological explanations, like God meant both. There are a lot of theological explanations. But the general premise is that the Torah wasn't given as a verdict by God for humans to follow. It was given to humans. When you give a gift to someone, yeah, it's given from me to you, and there are certain conditions, right? There are conditions of the giver, and there are conditions of the receiver. The giver gives it with certain conditions. The receiver receives it with certain conditions, right? That's usually how every exchange or gift takes place. This applies to Torah also. God gave it to us. There are certain conditions he gave it by, right? So for example, if I was speaking to a Reform Jew, I would say part of the conditions were to have a mechitza when you pray, or right, the Torah was written by Moshe Rabbeinu, or whatever conditions he gave them by, which you can't follow. But then once they were given to the humans, we have certain conditions. Rabbi Uziel says, for example, if the Torah were to tell me the sky was not blue, I would not listen to the Torah. There are certain conditions we place on the Torah that are the receiver's condition. And the Rebbe, and actually I saw Rabbi Yeshua Heschel, who taught in the Reform University in Hebrew Union College, and the Rebbe, about the same time-ish, they've developed the same theory about a debate between two parties of thought amongst the Tanaim. You had the Rabbi Akiva's, you had the Rabbi Yishmael's. Rabbi Akiva, the Rebbe explained this, he was a Baal Tshuva. He saw the Torah as a divine one, right? There's Midrashim where he says, if not for the Torah saying this, I wouldn't have believed this. Moshe Rabbeinu is touching the chair God is sitting on, right? Generally speaking, Rabbi Akiva was more of the mystic, more of the seeing things on God's term. And Rabbi Shmuel liked to rationalize things and make it more suitable for him. You also have this a lot with their halachic rulings. It says when the Jews accepted the Torah, they said yes, yes, and they said yes, yes. Meaning when God said don't kill, they said yes. When God said keep Shabbat, they said yes. Rabbi Shmuel said no. They said no to this and yes to this, right? You have a lot of debates. If you break down, you'll come to the conclusion, you'll see that Rabbi Shmuel often he'd change it a bit, right? To make it sit better with how he saw it. Rabbi Akiva would not feel comfortable to change it. And you have this debate throughout Heschel's introduction to his book of Torah Min HaShamayim. He goes through a whole bunch of examples, and even in his book, he starts discussing this idea. But you see throughout the generations, you had the rationalists and you had the people mystics. You had the Rabbi Shmuel's. I don't think he also compared it to Halacha and Agadah, the mystics and the logic and the mistos people, right? And so the general premise behind Halacha is that it's our Torah. We decide. Torah was given to us, it's ours. Rabbinic consensus, it's not because the majority are probably right. Rabbinic consensus determines halacha. It's not like science where it could be the majority got it wrong. In halacha, it's categorically impossible for the majority to get it wrong because logic is an inherent part of halacha. When a rabbi makes a decision in halacha based on his own logic, that becomes the halachic ruling, not because the rabbi is probably right, but because the Torah was made in a way that logic is inherent to it. That way, when a rabbi makes a ruling, that becomes Torah. The rabbinic consensus in the Talmud becomes the ruling.